Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got a very special review to do for you today. Not just because of the beers, but this specific review marks the 150th review that I have done on my channel since I started back in May of 2019. And it's been a very fun journey, and I'm really quite pleased with reaching this milestone. So I knew it was coming up, and I set aside a couple of beers that I expect are going to be very special. They're completely different, but special indeed. So the first beer we're going to review, as you may already guess, it's not your average beer. This is the first I've ever had from this brewer. This is called Hive Alive. It's by Strange Roots, based in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania, and this is a honey ale. It's an ale that's been brewed with a large percentage of honey. They tell you the specifics on here. 78% barley to 22% orange blossom honey, and it was fermented with wild Pennsylvania yeast. So 17.3% ABV on this one. That's a pretty high, and I'm going to be drinking this at room temperature because I think that it's going to share a lot more in common with a mead than your standard beer. So much higher ABV than your average beer, to be certain. This is a lot more aligned with typical mead ABV, but I expect it's going to be very special. I can't wait to try this one. And then number two, I mentioned this many reviews back, but I got from Tavour a series of 2015 through 2019, one bottle of each year, so 5 separate bottles of Heathen Brewing's seasonal release. They release in the winter, called Reindeer Tears. It's a bourbon barrel aged barley wine. I've had quite a few beers by Heathen. I've never had this one. Barley wine is my absolute favorite beer style of them all. Barrel aged versions even tend to kick that intensity up another notch. So I decided to split the difference. Today we're going to be trying their 2017 release. So I kind of split right in the middle, picked the middle of the pack of the bottles that I have. And I've been saving these for a special occasion, and I think that the 150th review is a pretty good one. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to get started with Strange Roots Hive Alive, the honey ale that clocks in at 17.3% ABV. Okay, so jumping right into the first beer of today's review, we have got Strange Roots Hive Alive. This is a honey ale. 22% orange blossom honey, 78% barley in this one, and it was fermented with wild Pennsylvania yeast. They are based in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania. 17.3% ABV on this one. So this shares a lot of commonality with a mead, and that's exactly why it's it's the very first beer I've ever done. I'm doing it at room temperature, and I think that its likeness much more to mead than a typical beer is going to be the right call. So first, I'm going to have to peel this little sticker off, and this is corked, as you can probably and obviously tell. So I do have my cork pull here. So we're just going to get this burrowed right down into that cork. All right. And this isn't a particularly fancy cork pull, but it does work well. It's very sturdy. All right. And pulled that straight out. Let's give the cork a sniff. Oh, yeah, that smells really nice. This really does smell a lot like mead. I don't know how much mead any of you may drink, but being based in Tampa, Florida, Cigar City Brewing Company, one of the top rated brewers in the country, I am very fortunate of that fact. Unless you live locally, you probably don't know they also have a cider and meadery, and down in that area of Tampa I've spoken about a few times on this channel. It's a really neat part of town, a very historic neighborhood, Ybor City. They have a cider and meadery location there, and I go there a few times a year, and it is an absolute treat. So this is very high ABV, so we're going to be using a small little goblet glass today. I do not need to fill this whole thing up, so I'm just going to pour a bit into here. We're not even going to fill that halfway. That's probably sufficient to get this going. Visually, it's absolutely lovely. It is a true honey gold in color, as I expected for a honey ale. Yeah, and give it a sniff right over the rim. You can smell there is definitely a higher ABV than your average libation, but it doesn't smell boozy per se. It has the presence, say, of sticking your nose over a cordial or a mead, which is really what it's reminding me of strongly, and I expect it's going to share a lot of commonality, but it smells absolutely delicious. Absolutely delicious. Slight kind of apple hints in the back, maybe apple and pear, very strong of honey. It smells very sweet and it smells absolutely delicious. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in. Oh, oh, that's really, really good. Ooh, this is a big beer indeed. Wow. Okay, that one took me by surprise. Absolutely made the right call. Room temperature. This chilled would absolutely just dull it. Now, drink it like it's mead. For sure, that's the right call. Just room temp. Now, if you have a cooler climate, you know, you could still leave it out. Maybe it's a little cooler, but you don't want it like refrigerator cold. Definitely not. And same thing with mead. You drink mead room temp. You don't chill them. I mean, I guess you could, but what would be the point? You want to taste and experience the entire drink. And in this case, it's beer, and it's absolutely delicious. So what comes through in the flavor profile is this big, bursty, bright sweetness. It does taste very much like honey. There is a little bit of an orange undertone. It is made with orange blossom honey, and not all honey is the same. Orange blossom honey does legitimately impart this slight orange-like both aroma and flavor to the actual honey product. Florida is a big producer of orange blossom honey, so I'm intimately familiar with it. In fact, that's very easy to find in any grocery store around here and at very good prices. Another perk of living in Florida. But this is delicious. This absolutely shares far more in common with a mead than it does a beer. That much is certain, but it is indeed a beer. It is a honey ale. There is far more barley in this than there is honey added in, which, if you don't know what mead is one of the oldest alcoholic beverages in the world. It's a honey-based fermented alcoholic beverage, and you know, they don't use grains. It's all done with honey, and you can add other things in there as well. But this is kind of taking that recipe, turning it up on its head by using, give or take, 3/4 of barley to 1/4 of honey. But it really, really makes a very nice beer. Very nice beer. And this wild Pennsylvania yeast, I kind of expect if this were a different type of beer, it would probably impart some funkiness. But just due to the nature of it, it's coming through much more like a typical mead would do. So very big, bold, pungent flavors and aromas, but there's no hint of funk at all. No hint of funk whatsoever. I'm going to jump back in here, kind of an interesting review. So body and mouthfeel, no real gauge. This is the first beer like this I've ever had. I'm really thinking I'm going to rate this more akin to how I would test and rate a mead. So that's going to be my yardstick. So let's jump in for body and mouthfeel. It really does remind me so much of mead, and that is such a high compliment. It's so delicious. Before I get into the body and the mouthfeel, every time I get this all over the taste buds, it's just this burst of deliciousness. Honey, there is absolutely citrus. Orange notably, there's absolutely nuances of pear and apple. It tastes just like a big burst of bright, fresh, ripe fruit covered in honey. And it doesn't taste like baked, like there's no kind of baked goods or caramelized sugars or anything, and that's not typical with the mead. And indeed, this really does put me in mind of mead. It absolutely does. So the body and the mouthfeel. Body and the mouthfeel are pretty much prototypical of what you would expect from a mead. It's not a super heavy body, even though the ABV is higher. It's completely different than a beer that would be brewed approaching this ABV range. I mean, there are some. If you've never had them, they're very interesting. There's some way higher than 17.3. They're hard to find, but it's definitely a beer drinking experience. But on this, body and mouthfeel, exactly what I anticipated. It's basically just like mead. It's not super heavy. Overall, the body is roughly a medium intensity, medium robustness, but there is a good bit of resistance. It's got a natural thickness to it. It's not syrupy, it's just very resistant, and it has natural viscosity. It's spot on. It's exactly what I expected from this beer, expecting it to be like mead, and indeed it is. In terms of the flavor profile, it's very bold, it's very pungent, very fruity, and all of that comes up front. And there is this suggestion of booziness without it tasting like a boozy beer, what you would term boozy. It doesn't taste boozy, but it's got this warming sensation like you get from wine and something with a higher ABV. That's really what it's imparting here. It's not imparting booziness whatsoever, and it's absolutely delicious. In terms of finish, this shares far more in common with a mead than it does a beer. If this were mead and not a honey ale, I would say this is just prototypical and it's exceptionally well executed. It being a beer, I can't really compare it to a beer, but the finish is very typical of a mead finish. It does linger a little bit on the back with the flavors that you get, those big bright fruit and the honey, but it doesn't really stick with that same intensity for a very long period of time like your typical beer. So if you're expecting a very long, big, bold finish, you're not going to get it in this, and indeed you don't get it in mead. But that's what this reminds me most closely of, so that is going to be my yardstick. So it is exactly what I expected. Head and retention, it just doesn't apply here. So that's really not applicable since I can't really give points or dock them. I don't want to take points off unfairly, so I can already tell you that's going to get top marks. It's exactly what I expected. In terms of appearance, it's lovely. The balance on this is just truly delicious. What they did with this barley and what they did with this honey, I think they really probably tried, I would have to assume that they tried some different ratios here to settle on this because it really did make a very special beer. This is predominantly barley. Make no mistake, it is essentially 3/4 barley, slightly over, and about 1/4 honey, slightly less. But the way that it works together is just absolutely beautiful. Honestly, I wouldn't change a thing about it. I absolutely love it. I am going to take my time sipping on this. It's 17.3. It's going to take me several hours. This is not to be slammed. This is meant to be sipped slowly over many, many hours and enjoyed. And I'm going to do just that. When we get back, we will get to our second beer of today's review. That is Heathen Brewing's Reindeer Tears 2017 release, the bourbon barrel-aged barley wine that clocks in at 12% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's review, we have got Heathen Brewing Company's Reindeer Tears 2017 release, bourbon barrel-aged barley wine. This one clocks in at 12% ABV. Heathen Brewing is based in Vancouver, Washington. So this was part of a collection of different year releases from Heathen of this same beer. I got 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19. Got it through Tavour as I got both beers here. And this one I thought was a really good choice for me because I absolutely love barley wine. It's not the easiest beer style to find. And so for this one, I said, let's just jump right in the middle of the pack. So 2017 is the middle of all of the beers I got. So this is going to be my first stab into this collection of barley wines by Heathen. And I'm very, very excited. So yet again, I've got my opener with the nice sharp tip. I'm just scoring up underneath this nice wax seal. And then hopefully that'll give us room for leverage. And indeed it did. Got it on the first try. So in terms of label art on this, you'll see, and they all look the same on all of them. It's got a reindeer with tears pouring out of its eye socket. I know it's probably hard to see. And a very, very maniacal looking Santa. It doesn't look like a typical Christmas scene celebration on there. It's pretty neat label art. So nonetheless, let's get this poured right in the glass. Actually, I'm just going to take one quick sweep over the edge of that wax. Make sure. I thought I saw some small parts that I don't want to drop in there. It wouldn't hurt anything, but don't want to drink it. All right. Getting that poured right in the glass. Okay, so this is very much on the lighter end of the spectrum. It's still in normal range, but very much that caramelly color. They tend to be a bit darker than this on average, but that's okay. This is absolutely in range. Yeah, looks quite nice. Formed a pretty decent head on top. I can see a decent bit of carbonation going as well. Kind of a mix of small and medium bubbles. And yeah, it looks really nice. And I can tell you, it has a very pungent aroma. I can smell it from here, and I'm holding this probably 2.5 feet away from my nose. So if I get right up on it, oh yeah. It smells very nice. It smells very, very nice. You can very, very clearly smell the bourbon. And there are these underlying elements of classic barley wine aromas, but there's also some very interesting other aromas that I'm getting out of this that I don't normally get in a barley wine. There's some much brighter floral and fruity elements that are coming through in this instead of super rich. Now it does have some classic, yeah, that bourbon smells so good. Some classic aromas as you might expect. There is kind of a raisiny and fig and kind of date-like, some of those rich fruit, but there's also just this floating lighter and floral and bordering on citrusy side as well. So it has a very interesting and unique aroma profile. So without further ado, we're going to jump in and see how this tastes. Oh yeah, that's a big beer. Oh yeah, that's a big, big beer. This is classic barley wine. So some of the elements I picked up in the aroma, oh, ooh, it's so good, are absolutely coming through in the flavor. But overall, I would say that the flavor profile is more or less a classic, what you would expect out of a barley wine. There are some interesting elements. For one, this one does taste quite a bit boozier, perhaps, than your average barley wine. I drink a fair bit of barley wines. This one definitely is on the boozier end. And it's not off-putting. It's really pairing well with that bourbon barrel aging. And it's letting that element of the beer speak very clearly. And it's quite nice the way that it pairs. Now, in terms of other elements of this flavor profile, you do get a quick burst of some of those brighter fruit. I wouldn't say on first sip I'd be able to pick them out and tell you what it tasted like. There also was a definitive, what I smelled, a slightly floral quality. You're getting that on here. So there's elements of this that remind me of drinking different types of IPAs from different hop characteristics and profiles, but only in barley wine form. And on that same note, this beer actually does have a reasonably nice kick of bitters. This is not super common in a barley wine. I personally really, really like it. I wouldn't say that it tastes hoppy. That's not how I would describe it. It's just got a bigger, bitter presence than your average barley wine. They're definitely big beers. They tend to be richer, thicker, denser, and interplay with all these caramelly and malty and fruity characteristics, and typically on the richer side. And that's definitely in this beer. But it's got some very interesting elements that I wasn't expecting, and I very much am enjoying that they're here. So I'm going to jump in for another sip. This is very, very complex. I'm going to think about body and mouthfeel and try to pick apart some more of this flavor profile. This is a very, very large body. It's heavy. There's no two ways about it. Very heavy body. It's very robust. The mouthfeel has a good bit of resistance to it, though I wouldn't necessarily call it viscous, but it is thick. And there is quite a bit of resistance when you agitate around the palate. And in this one, it does kind of add kind of a creamy element to the texture around the palate when you do agitate. It's very, very nice, and it feels right. The body and the mouthfeel feel like they go together. There's not like one that's completely on the opposite end of the spectrum as the other. They do complement one another. In terms of these flavors, it's very interesting because this has this nice bitter kick in the middle, and it's just kind of taking all these other ribbons of flavors and moving around in them. So you're getting this very different experience than you would typically find in your average barley wine. This is a very special one to me. I'm very much enjoying what I'm experiencing here. Aside from the bitters, the notable classic barley wine flavors that are really jumping out at me, there is a very nice caramel and toffee-like quality that comes through. And really the bitters seem to be kind of binding to that element. So it's like the base malts in the beer, that's where the bitters are binding. And On second sip even, that bitter profile is even more intense than it was on first sip, and it's really giving this beer a very long finish. I mean, there's lingering bourbon, absolutely, to be certain, and there's lingering underlying kind of the fig and date-like qualities as well, but it's very much bourbon and bitters. That's like the big two that are pushing out the end of this finish, and it's huge. This is a huge barley wine. I mean, they're all big, but this is a particularly big one. Very, very, very good. I'm going to jump in one more sip, final thoughts, make sure I didn't miss anything pertinent for you. Nice boozy kick, big burst of bourbon, figs, dates, plums. There's a suggestion of apricot, then just a big intensity of bitters. And it intensifies, intensifies, intensifies. And it's mixing with this caramel and this toffee. And they're really interplaying, and then all the fruit is just sitting underneath. And it really holds at about that same ratio once all the flavors kind of open up and boom, there they are. And it holds very steady for a pretty good long time before a very slow descent on the end of the finish. It's very, very, very long. This is an absolutely delicious barley wine. If you've never had a barley wine that's on the bitter side and you're a fan of the style, these would definitely be some to seek. It looks like they release them every year. I just tried the 2017, so I'm very much looking forward to trying some more, though I am going to cellar some. Nonetheless, I'm going to take my time, sip on this, count my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked. Starting with Strange Roots Hive Alive, this was a honey ale clocked in at 17.3% ABV. They're based in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania. For the aroma on this was absolutely massive. I mean, just absolutely massive. 3.5, 4 feet away, you could still smell it. Positively pungent, and it smelled wonderful. Very sweet, very fruity, very honey-like. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, I absolutely loved it. This beer, I kind of had a suspicion, would bear a lot of commonality with the mead, and indeed it did, and that's very high praise. The taste on this was exceptional. I mean, honestly, I've had meads that as actual mead were not as good as this one. And frankly, for me, really, just a little bit more presence of the honey in there was about the only thing I could say I was craving in the taste. But overall, I loved it. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the body was perfect. Really, for this beer, it shared so much commonality with the mead. I used mead as a benchmark. The body was exactly what I expected. It gets a 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same thing here. Compared to mead, it's exactly what I expected. It gets a 10 out of 10. The finish on this was very long. Very, very long. Mead can sometimes have a long finish, but this, this really showed kind of the beer side. It was a beer with a lot of commonalities with mead, and frankly, it really, the finish was quite a bit longer than I anticipated. It was impressively long. It gets a 10 out of 10. Head retention, I didn't expect there to be any. Indeed, there wasn't. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the appearance, this was absolutely lovely. If you had told me this was mead in the bottle and looking at it in the glass, I would have believed it. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance, overall, I thought this beer was exceptionally well balanced. Exceptionally well balanced. And I mentioned this on taste, and really this is the only slight nitpick. I would have liked just a little more honey presence from this one to kind of put it over the top for me, but a minor nitpick. I still gave it a 9 out of 10. Feeling intangible, I loved it. I loved it. Honestly, I would barely have tweaked this beer. I thought it was very, very close to perfection. Gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, this is an example of the style. This is a very interesting beer, certainly one of the most unique I've reviewed. And I'm going to stick to my guns and say on this that really judging as you would judge a mead is really the safest and most fair way to rank this. And if this were indeed a mead, it would have been absolutely top tier. As an example of the style that gets a 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on Strange Roots Hive Alive to a 98 out of 100. This is almost as good as it gets, folks. If you're a fan of mead or if you're a fan of trying new beers, I highly recommend this one. It is absolutely delicious. Moving on to beer number 2. This is Heathen Brewing's Reindeer Tears, the 2017 release, a bourbon barrel-aged barley wine clocking in at 12% ABV. They are based in Vancouver, Washington. For the aroma, The aroma on this beer was equally as pungent as this one. I mean, just positively massive. You could smell classic barley wine aromas as well as that bourbon barrel back. Perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, I loved it. This beer was quite a bit different in terms of its flavor profile than, say, your average barley wine. It had a lot of the common traits, but there were some very interesting flavor elements that really kind of gave an interesting interplay. This was not your average barley wine. And I really liked that bourbon back on there. It just helped bring in all these interesting ribbons of flavors as well as the classic ones you expect. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10 from me. For the body was huge. It was big on a big barley wine, exactly what I expected. Gets a 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same thing. Barley wines can kind of be all over the board, but this one, the mouthfeel really was what I expected. It was very thick, very resistant, and matched the body perfectly. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was exceptionally long. Had this nice little boozy back, that bourbon just keep pushing out, and all those other ribbons of flavors, and it lasted a very, very, very long time, even long for a barley wine. This gets a 10 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did a pretty decent job. 2017, middle of the pack. As we know, as beers age, they tend to lose some of their carbonation, just part of the natural process of being in a bottle. It's not a perfect vessel, but it does a pretty good job. I imagine when I get into some of the newer releases, the 2018 or 2019, that we might see a little better head retention and creation just due to there being more carbonation in there, less has seeped out. But honestly, this did better than I expected. It was above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the appearance, this was certainly in range for a barley wine, but it was one of those on the very lighter brown, kind of that caramelly color spectrum. But, you know, it is what it is. Not exactly the standard, but it's in range. I only dock 1 point. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the balance, overall, I really enjoyed the balance on this beer. Really, the only thing I could say is maybe some of those elements that made it so interesting were just a little much in the forefront to get some of the more classic notes come through. I would have liked a little more fig and date and interplay, maybe some of those classic cobbler-like interplays. And indeed, even though the malt bill was very much caramel and toffee, the pungency of these other flavors that were in there kind of overshadowed some of those a little bit. You could pick them out, but I would have liked a little bit more presence. I docked 1 point here. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the feeling and the intangible, I loved it. This was a solid barley wine. I really enjoyed it. It gets a 10 out of 10 from me. Finally, as an example of the style, this beer got mostly 10s across the board. Just a couple little categories with a couple little minor tweaks, but overall, this was such a strong example of, you know, a really well done barley wine. I gave it top marks. It gets a 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on Heathen Brewing's Reindeer Tears 2017 release to a 96 out of 100. So we're looking at two absolutely massive top tier beers here, a 98 and a 96. It's been a while since I've had a couple in the same episode that have ranked this high, and I absolutely believe that both beers well earned those rankings. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can just click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.